Good evening, good evening, good evening, and happy Monday. This last Monday of November. Hopefully, everybody had a really good holiday, good extended Thanksgiving break. Tonight, we wanted to reflect as we go through the month of November and give Thanksgiving, and really tell or show the story of Nashville as we think about our public schools. I want to give a huge shout out to the good people over at the Nashville Public Education Fund who took time, effort, and dollars to create a documentary that we should be proud of as Nashvillians, but one, to make sure we're relentless in making sure where we are as a school system doesn't continue to be the same way. Because as you'll see in this documentary, we've come a long way, um, but we haven't gone far enough. And so we're going to spend this time showing the documentary. If you have not been able to check it out, it's called By Design: The Shaping of Nashville Public Schools. I had the honor to get a chance to view it when it first was released at the Belcourt Theater. And so we wanted to give our parents who have gone through our fellowship, who have come to our events, who have been on Access Denied, to also get a chance to see it. And so with that, I will take time and we will crank this up. If you do have questions or comments, please comment as you watch this and let us know how you feel.
Our job is to give our students the necessary tools to become transformative humans in their time. People evolve, societies evolve, things change. Is our education system outdated? Does it need to be revised? At the time of birth, some of us are more privileged than others. How has our education system really been designed, and who was it really created for?
One of the challenges in figuring out how to talk about educational inequality in Nashville is figuring out where to start. And I would suggest that we really need to reach back quite far.
In the 19th century, Nashville's population had two groups of people, white and black. Whites made up about 75% of the population. African Americans made about 25% of the population. The city of Nashville had started their first schools, the Hume School, and then later the Fogg School. There were a handful of private schools, but most people got their education from the local Nashville public schools. Because of laws in the South, including Nashville, it was illegal to teach African Americans to read and write.
There were clandestine schools or native schools in Nashville in the 1830s. African Americans in Nashville always had an interest in education and sought ways to provide that education.
From 1862 to 1865, Nashville was what was considered an occupied city. And during that time, there was no local government. So there was no education of white citizens at all the schools because the students and the teachers were all either have fled the city or were arrested. When the Civil War was over, there was this new era that a lot of people needed to be educated quickly and they needed to be educated at once. The Freedmen's Bureau was made especially for formerly enslaved people and African Americans to help them get on their feet, to be educated, and to give them the tools to be productive citizens. They opened up a series of Freedmen's Bureau schools. Although one of the nicknames of the city was always the Athens of the South, it could have easily been called the African American Athens of the South. Nashville was very fortunate to have schools like Fisk University, Central Tennessee College, Roger Williams University, and Tennessee A&I, and then Meharry Medical College. We basically had 5 institutions of higher learning and graduate schools. African Americans experienced a lot of successes in Nashville, and all of that was going very well until the Jim Crow laws of the 1890s.
It is a way to put African Americans back in their place. In many ways, Tennessee becomes a model for other states in the South.
The state of Tennessee made it illegal to educate African Americans and whites in the same classroom anywhere in the state. And it was during this time the inequities started to really show.
Nashville and Davidson County are a big place. And so what Jim Crow schooling looks like depends not only on where you are, whether you're in a segregated Black or segregated white school, but whether you're in a rural school or an urban school.
Nashville had 4 unique public school systems. You had a Black school system in Davidson County and a white school system in Davidson County. And then you had a Black school system in the city of Nashville and a white school system in the city of Nashville. If you were African American and you lived in the other parts of the county that wasn't the city, your school was a one-room schoolhouse. And that's how African Americans were educated in the county. The city had a bigger budget for its schools, whereas a white school might get, a large teaching staff and a building and better grounds. The African American schools were smaller. And that was the difference, that literally the Plessy versus Ferguson United States Supreme Court decision ruled that separate was equal. And it clearly was not equal in Tennessee.
Meggs High School was the first African American school for Blacks in Nashville. They demoted it to more or less a middle school. That's the way we refer to it today. And Pearl became the high school, the preeminent high school as a graduate of Pearl High.
It's really clear from the stories of individuals who attended Pearl, who attended Cameron, that especially in the era of segregation, that connection between school and community was positive, reinforcing, and really important to the community.
Although Pearl did not have the same resources, from a building, from books, to other infrastructure, you couldn't tell that by talking to any Pearl student or alum. They were just as proud, maybe even prouder, than the white students that had gone to Hume Fogg, that had gone to Central, that had gone to West.
I look back and I picture my mind and looking at some of the pictures that are here from the late 1800s and the early 1900s. I see me in 1955. I see those in 1920s. And I see all of those that have come through this building that have done real well and made a good life for themselves. How smart these kids were, how intelligent these kids were, how knowledgeable these kids were, and how the teachers helped propel them into being something. They made sure that their kids, everybody had the best of everything.
We could do and be anything that we wanted to be, regardless of any racial restrictions that may have been obstacles intentionally placed in one's path.
The most famous mayor of Nashville that no one has ever heard of was Hillary House. Hillary House was elected in 1909, beating an incumbent mayor by almost 80 points. Hillary House ran on a platform that he would take care of the needs of this growing city. And the needs were infrastructure. That means buildings, bridges, and schools.
What do city planners have to do with schools, right? They seem like they would be two separate things. But if you're talking about a growing city in the 1920s and the 1930s, you're talking about a place where people are trying to figure out what the future is going to look like. And especially white elite business members are interested in organizing the city in ways that are going to serve their interests. So the City Planning Commission is involved in mapping the city. They had to decide whether they wanted to encourage the neighborhoods to continue to exist as they did, or whether they wanted to try to change them. And urban renewal and public housing construction and decisions about where to build schools or other facilities were all connected to their interest in changing who lived where in the city. They thought the appropriate neighborhood unit was one that was people of quote unquote similar ethnic groups. If you were to look at the East Nashville geography, you'd see city planners talking about how around Warner School, they were going to think of that as a white school that would have white residential development around it. And on the other side of Main Street, they would see Meigs School, which was a segregated Black school, and they would think about planning public housing for Black residents on that side of the street. They thought they could use the combination of housing and schooling to draw a line of segregation in East Nashville. They were binding together segregation in housing, segregation in schooling, and segregation in the very concepts of how people understood the city. So if you stand in front of the Tennessee State Capitol today and look north, you see a lot of grass. If you had been there in the 1940s or 1950s, you'd actually see a pretty dense landscape of buildings. They were homes to people who presumably couldn't afford to live in other areas of the city. And those homes were right next to the Capitol, and those homes were right next to the downtown business district. So when Nashville's ambitious city boosters in the 1950s thought, how do we want our city to look? How do we want to attract new business? How do we want to bring new investment? They thought of the area around the Capitol as something of an embarrassment. They weren't embarrassed necessarily about the economic conditions that led people, and many of them Black people, to live in poverty, but they were embarrassed about the juxtaposition between the state capitol and those houses. So the Capitol Hill Urban Renewal Project was designed to wipe out, to clean up, to, in some ways, erase the evidence of that poverty and that inequality from Capitol Hill. Like many other cities, Nashville got federal urban renewal dollars in the 1950s, and they used it in what's called sort of bulldozer clearance. They sort of plowed down a lot of those buildings, remade the street grid, created the park space around the Capitol, and in the process justified what they were doing in terms of disruption of residents and their lives as appropriate because those lives weren't considered to be worth very much. There's much interest in the Capitol Hill Urban Renewal Project in making a shiny new vision of the city, and very little attention to the lived experiences of people in those places. And that's a story that happens over and over in urban renewal projects in Nashville.
Urban renewal in the 50s completely decimated what had been traditional Black communities. Neighborhoods were shifted, and obviously the impact on the community is, where do all of these people migrate to? Where do they go? And obviously housing and residential placement is going to impact schools.
You are still very limited of where an African American could buy a house and live because of redlining, and just because of people would not sell you a house in West Nashville, Green Hills, or Belmead. That was just not an option. A bank would not lend you money to buy a house in Green Hill. So you were very limited of where you could live.
White people in Nashville, just like white people around the US in the mid 20th century, got a lot of help to move to the suburbs. Through the FHA and through the GI Bill, you could get a subsidized mortgage to move to a suburban home, making home ownership available in ways that it had not been previously. There are some Black Nashvillians, like some Black people in other parts of the US, who are able to make that move to the suburbs, but they don't have access to that same help. More than 95% of the federally subsidized mortgage dollars go to white families. Schools have long been central to community life in many parts of our country, but those stories of connection between education and schools and community life are really, really clear when we're thinking about segregated Black neighborhoods in the Jim Crow era. Segregation produced a situation where Black individuals and communities, to some extent, had fewer choices than they would later have after the end of formal segregation. And one of the reasons that Black communities all over the country felt the need to push for desegregation was this persistent inequality in the resources given to Black communities.
The Brown versus Board of Education famous Supreme Court decision came out in 1954. The very next year in Nashville, Tennessee, our schools were 100% white and 100% Black. It's almost like the decision didn't happen or nobody in Nashville had ever heard of Brown.
It takes local families and local attorneys deciding to ask the local courts to make Brown happen in their community. Of course, it would have been possible for a local school board to say, the Supreme Court ruled against segregation and we'll change our policy now. That tended not to happen in the US South.
Z. Alexander Luby was no stranger to the courtroom, especially as it related to students and civil rights. If anybody needed a lawyer in Nashville to file against the city, he was the first name that people would want to call.
Avon Williams studies and is a protege of Luby.
Z. Alexander Luby and Avon Williams had to locate local families who were willing to try to make Brown happen in Nashville. A.Z. Kelly was a barber in East Nashville. He had several children, and one of them was named Robert. And Robert was about to enter high school, and he lived closest to East High School in East Nashville. But Robert was a Black student, and East High School was a historically segregated white school. And when Robert tried to enroll at East, he was told he had to go to Pearl, which was the city high school for Black students at the time.
So in 1955, again, Luby and Avon Williams filed suit. It was Kelly versus Board of Education of Nashville to begin the desegregation of the school system here in Nashville. That case is the longest running school desegregation case in the nation. That case was not ultimately settled until 1998.
The city came up with a plan to comply with Brown. And the Nashville plan basically would be a stair-step plan of gradually integrating the schools, starting at first grade and doing that grade 1 year, and then second grade the next year, and then third grade the next year. So it would take 12 years for the schools to be fully integrated. And of course, starting at the youngest grades as opposed to starting in the high schools.
On that plan, it would have taken until 1968 for the first children to graduate from the city of Nashville, having attended desegregated schools all the way through. It was actually accelerated until 1966. But the point is, it took a very long time, fully 12 years beyond the Brown decision. And at that point, there's still very, very few of Nashville's children overall who are attending desegregated schools. And there are other cities that approached this differently. Charlotte, North Carolina, most famously, Louisville, Kentucky also.
Nashville was a divided city, and probably even more than who got to sit next to each other at a movie theater or at a lunch counter or on a bus, the number one pushback for integration was who got to sit next to your kid in a classroom.
Resistance to desegregation in the 1950s came from so many different corners in Nashville. It's true that quote unquote outside agitators like John Casper came to town and helped organize really aggressive, vocal, sometimes quite violent resistance to desegregation. But it's also true that the resistance of someone like Cecil Sims, a local lawyer who said, well, we don't have to protest, we can just use zoning to avoid desegregation, should count as resistance as well. So school board member Cecil Sims, who was a local attorney, read the Brown decision carefully, probably, and thought about what it would mean for his city. And one of his contributions to how the city would respond to Brown was the idea that you could use zoning as a way to avoid desegregation. This was what Sims called intelligent zoning. And what he meant was that if you recognize that the city was a residentially segregated city, you could create school zone lines where you would maximize the number of Black children in a zone for a given school. You'd maximize the number of white children in a zone for another school. And thereby, you could say that you had desegregated those schools because they were open to all the children who lived in that zone. And Sims does that with the power of the local elite, with the power of a school board seat. And so we've got to think about resistance, not just in terms of angry white parents marching under the banner of a KKK sign, which certainly happened, but also respected city leaders, overwhelmingly white men, using their power to slowly and quietly stall and avoid desegregation.
There was an organized campaign to make sure that African American students and white students were educated together. The White Citizens Council was a group that had chapters all over the South. This is an application for admission to the White Citizens Council. And this is an article they took out in the banner. And it says, to the parents and citizens of Nashville, we can keep separate schools for whites and Negroes. There was all this legislation in the state to basically, codify segregation, and they're asking them to support this. September 9th, 1957 is one of the most significant days in Nashville history. It is on that day, because of a court order, that African American students, escorted by their parents and protected by local police, went to a white school for the first time.
My mother had my hand and we walked together. And one thing I can say about my mother, she never showed any fear.
I had a big pencil in my hand, had my notebook in the other hand. I was smiling.
My grandmother made me a beautiful purple lilac dress with plaits. And so I was excited. I was ready to go. We walked up to Cleveland Street and turned left. When we turned left, there was all these people with signs and a lot of noise. I thought it was a parade.
Well, on the picture, it's me, Linda's mother, her name was Grace, and her daughter, Linda, and a bunch of people hollering and yelling with signs, niggas go home. I thought I belonged there with all the other kids, but, other people saw it different.
My dad was a farmer prior to going to the war. When I look at myself as a 6-year-old in pictures, my father is looking ahead. And so that lets me know that he was leading by example of how he wanted me to be calm, not fearful, because I was going to school. And that was the emphasis.
That morning was marred by having to walk a gauntlet of angry whites shouting, throwing things, having signs that said, "You don't belong here, go home, you will be harmed," and hurling racial epithets at the young ears that were just there to learn. An African American doll was hung in effigy with a sign that said, "Nigger, this could be you." That was the message that the city of Nashville was sending to those who wanted to go to white schools.
At night, there was an explosion, big explosion. We could hear it. We could, you could feel it. In one of the schools, one of the brand new schools, was blown up. Hattie Cotton. Only one little girl was going there. Only one little girl. And they blew up that brand new school.
Glass was shattered. The clock that showed the time a little after midnight was still stuck in its place. Just because it happened at Hattie Cotton didn't mean it wouldn't happen somewhere else. There were bomb threats. There were other anonymous phone calls of people calling and telling them not to send their kids to a white school or they would be harmed, they would be killed.
There was a bomb threat to Buena Vista School, and the principal actually called Earl Rose and myself to the office, and he personally put us in his car and had us just kneel down in the back of the car on the floorboard. To my knowledge, I went back to school the next day.
They didn't think we would last a week or even 6 months. But we went, Marvin and I, we went all the way to the 6th grade. It pulled back a peel of the onion that revealed that Nashville was really not as progressive in race relations as it perceived itself to be.
This was a symbol of, sadly, the years that would come about later with the bombing of Z. Alexander Luby's house and the violence that became of people attacking those that wanted to do the basic things of eat at the same lunch counter and sit in the same classroom as whites.
In 1963, the city and the county are consolidated, and that means that now there's Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools, bringing together the former City of Nashville schools and the former Davidson County into one school district. Nashville leaders argued in favor of consolidation. They felt like they could better organize the city's infrastructure, its municipal services, to recruit new businesses, to bring new investment into the city.
African Americans were leery of consolidation. One thing, consolidating the city and the county, obviously it would make the white population larger.
And the first mayor of Metro Nashville, Beverly Briley, spoke very directly about this. He spoke about how at 17% of the population, he didn't feel like Black voters were powerful enough to really require him to shift his agenda to serve their interests. In the first few years of Nashville's consolidated government, the Metropolitan School Board had only one Black representative. And that one representative, Isaiah Creswell, was a persistent advocate for Nashville's Black students. But because the board was appointed, and because the mayor at the time was choosing to put predominantly white Nashville residents on the board, Creswell was in some ways the only representative of Black Nashville in that policymaking body. The general question here is who gets to make decisions about the city schools?
My class was 100% African American from the neighborhood. I believe that we had limited resources.
The white schools had newer books, newer resources, games, with all the pieces there. When the outside suburban schools got new things, then they loaded up the old things and took them to the Black schools.
So the way Nashville achieves statistical desegregation from 1971 through the 1990s is through busing for desegregation. So under court order in 1971, Nashville starts moving children from schools that usually were closer to their home to others that were often farther away to achieve the court-required ratio of Black students to white students in each school.
Busing was attempting to solve a greater problem that was there because of segregation in housing and redlining, to get Black students and white students to physically be taught together, somebody had to be transported to a new or different school. And busing provided a balance that would have never naturally occurred because the neighborhoods that all these schools were in were practically all one race or another.
In 1971, they closed most of the elementary schools in the inner city. For example, the one I went to was Fort Greene, but they closed just about all of those schools. And so the African-American kids, the younger kids in the community were bussed out.
The thing about integration is that they bus babies.
Right.
And when your parents are not anywhere within a certain amount of time or distance to come and see about you, then you face problems for real.
By yourself.
By yourself. And it's a baby.
Mm-hmm.
We would get up at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning and be out there to catch a bus to ride 30 minutes to another school when we could literally walk to our neighborhood schools. It was a negative environment. We felt we were in hostile territory. They really didn't want us out there. And I sure to God did not want to be out there. Our teachers didn't come with us. Culture shock for me.
My memory of school really begins when busing begins for us. The very first part of busing was the kids from North Nashville coming to South Nashville. And that was the first time Norman Binkley was really integrated at all. And I was in 3rd grade, and it was Miss Cleveland. So when you think of civil rights in Nashville, Tennessee, you know, the people that come to mind are these incredible leaders like Bernard Lafayette or Dr. Lawson. But I think of Miss Cleveland. She was one of the first truly strong teachers that taught me about peacekeeping, about the importance of us being leaders.
One of the ways that busing illustrates desegregation's core paradox, that it was designed to create greater equality, but in the process, it generated new inequalities, was that Black students found themselves transported away from their home neighborhoods and going to school in less familiar and majority white communities for many more of their years of schooling than white students did. They were most likely to be assigned a suburban comprehensive high school in a majority white area for their high school years. Starting in 1971, the state of Tennessee was unveiling a major commitment to a new model of high school education, the comprehensive high school. This was going to be the way to provide a variety of educational opportunities to students, regardless of whether they were interested in college or in going into the workforce after high school. What that means for students attending new, comprehensive, and desegregating high schools is that somebody's going to make a decision about which academic track they're part of. Are they in college prep classes? Are they in general education classes? Are they in a vocational track? And in Nashville in the 1970s, as in many Southern districts, the vast majority of the people who are making those decisions are white guidance counselors. And there is enough evidence from interviews with high school students at that time that I'm comfortable in saying that a lot of the time those white guidance counselors made decisions about Black children that were based on their own racist judgments about what those children were capable of, rather than on the capabilities or the interest of those children.
My name is Waverly Crenshaw. I'm a federal district judge here in the Middle District of Tennessee. But the photo is at the McGavock High School commencement. The guidance counselor there on the first day in the first month of the new experiment at McGavock decided that I need to be in woodworking and auto mechanics. And those aren't necessarily college prep courses. I got out of those eventually.
Having a range of academic tracks in high schools opened new doors for segregation within Nashville schools, even as those schools were becoming overall desegregated. One of the challenges in this period of time was figuring out how to create statistical desegregation, even in the context of massive white resistance to busing. And Barbara Mann, who was one of the Black school board members in the early and mid 1980s, described her challenge in thinking about desegregation in this way. She said, quote, "To continually say to young Black youngsters that in order for you to get something that is good, you have to move into another community. You are saying something that carries the impression and perception of inferiority. And I think that has a psychological impact on the youngsters who are moved outward. I don't think that Black people live in places that are not fit for schools." So she was really trying to say there, how do we do desegregation in a way that doesn't undermine Black communities? Pearl was a historically Black school, which had been drawing teenagers from all over Nashville. But under the desegregation order, Pearl was supposed to attract a majority of white students and had a zone that was inclusive of predominantly white neighborhoods. But many white parents whose children were zoned to Pearl did not send them there. And therefore, the question perpetually was what to do with Pearl as a school that was not attracting white students under a system where a school had to be a white majority to be considered acceptably desegregated. White parents resisted desegregation in a variety of ways. One of the available options was to pull your children out of Metro Nashville Public Schools and choose a private school instead. Some new private schools were created at this moment to meet increasing demand.
There were so many Christian schools that began so that kids didn't have to get bused.
Our Metro public school system has really never been the same. The 20,000 or more students that we lost during that time who either went to private schools or whose family left the county had a huge impact on our system in our city. Because of busing, we lost over 20,000 students that we never got back.
After about 12 years of failing to secure enough white students who would attend Pearl to meet court-ordered racial ratios, the Board of Education began talking about closing Pearl.
The community became an outrage over trying to make an attempt to close Pearl High because it was our family, it was our home. And we knew that by the closure of this building, this school, we would no longer have any history.
Black community members in Nashville were very clear that doing so was threatening an important institution to them and their community, and that doing so sort of opened the door to understanding just how costly some aspects of desegregation had been. Local advocates who argued for Pearl to stay open talked very clearly about how urban renewal and highway construction and public housing construction, as well as unequal busing, had felt like it was taking things away from Nashville for years. And taking Pearl away was one more insult in that long history of not only failing to invest sufficiently in Black neighborhoods, but actively removing resources from those communities.
As a part of the agreement in principle, which was the 1982-83 court order, it was decided that they would have what they call academic magnet high schools. And the idea was to locate them within the inner city in order that you would attract students from all around the community, which would ensure, hopefully, desegregated populations of children. And that's why they located one at Hume Fall and the other one at my old school, Pearl High School, which is now Martin Luther King Jr. Magnet at Pearl High School. We made sure that that was included.
Magnet schools were in many ways a sort of opening step in a process of expanding school choice in Nashville, where rather than only going to zone schools, parents could choose between their zone school or a magnet school. But in ways that continued for a long time, magnet schools weren't actually equally available to everyone because, for example, the school system didn't provide transportation freely across all of those magnet schools. And so there was built into that process a preference for people with more resources to access those magnet schools.
I liked the idea of the magnet schools because, while on one hand I was trying to work with some students who came with some enormous disadvantages to the school system, I also wanted to make sure that students who were potentially the next Nobel Prize winner from Nashville, had the kind of educational opportunities that they needed as well.
Bredesen was the first mayor in the city of Nashville history to say public education is the most important thing I will do as mayor.
I'm a real believer that there's a lot of power in just going out to the end of the dock and jumping in the water if you want to learn how to swim, and that's really what I did with mayor, and have never regretted it. Yeah, for me, education, both at the state level when I was governor and when I was mayor, is arguably the most important thing that you do in government at the local and state level, and I just wanted to do it right. To figure out what people needed and get rid of all the yapping about stuff and the ideology and stuff, and just try to figure out how we can do a better job for these kids.
The Chamber of Commerce in the early 1990s commissioned a study about what would help Nashville grow more. This theme of how to make the city grow keeps coming back. And one of the things that they heard was that a strong school system would be an attractive part of recruiting new business. And local business leaders and local white politicians equated that idea of a stronger school system with the idea of ending desegregation. So Nashville leaders were part of arguing that desegregation was an obstacle to the city's growth. That's one argument. Another very different but simultaneous argument was a feeling on the part of Nashville's Black residents that the burdens of desegregation, especially the school closures and the unequally distributed expectations of busing, were no longer worth bearing. And they had tried through several iterations of legal advocacy to achieve a more equitable approach to desegregation, and it wasn't happening. And so with their attorneys, the plaintiffs began to talk about negotiating with the school board towards the end of the court order.
The school was under a desegregation order. And one of the things I wanted to do was to find a way to move beyond that in a way that was satisfactory to everybody. So I really believe in the notion of local schools that parents can become involved with and so on, but I also believe in the notion of not having racially segregated schools. And what I was trying to figure out is that, is it possible to make these two seemingly incompatible things, work together better? I think these are things we have to work out, in the community through the process we have.
This 43-year lawsuit had many successful arguments, but it took 43 years to settle. The main lawyers were C. Alexander Luby, Avon Williams, and Richard Dinkins.
My great-grandfather was born in slavery and graduated from Roger Williams University here in Nashville. Read this book, my boy, and learn what our people have suffered, have done, are suffering, and are doing, and resolve by the grace of God to make your mark in the world by helping to free them from civil and political oppression. That was written in May the 10th of 1893. That is in my DNA, if you will. And then coming here and going to law school and landing with Senator Avon Williams, who was litigating the school desegregation case, brings it full circle.
So he and I actually turned out to be friends and got along well, and just started talking about, how could this be made, how could this be made to work? And, it was not perfect, but, by building some more schools and some targeted areas that could genuinely draw from different parts of the community, but still be local, we put something together and, kind of went back to the court
together to get this thing done, which I think is the way to do it.
I think the mayor was listening, and at that time, and he engaged in that, and they came up with a pretty good plan.
The impact of this order would allow local control over the school system. The federal court would no longer be responsible. It would fall back into the hands of the school board to decide who was bused and who was not, where schools were built. And after 43 years of legal motions in front of many judges, the long Kelly case had finally been settled. The date Judge Wiseman settled the federal lawsuit, the plaintiff's attorney, Richard Dinkins, said that desegregation was always about equal access, and that's what this plan was about. But he also warned that there has to be a lot of trust on their side that the politicians and the school board would do all the things they told Judge Wiseman to do so they can get out from under this order.
The school system, in negotiating the end of desegregation, promised to provide more resources to those schools. They thought perhaps that those additional resources would also draw white children into those schools. But most importantly, for Black advocates, they promised a big expansion of resources in those schools. And pretty quickly, it became clear that that additional investment was not going to last. It was a commitment that, unlike making a building, required an annual decision to fund. And after not very many years, those additional investments weren't forthcoming. So after 1998, Nashville Public Schools end up with striking resegregation in Central City, predominantly Black and often predominantly poor schools. Failure to consistently invest in additional resources in those schools, and a neighborhood schools approach that's going to allow the development of enclave schools for some middle-class white families, so that there are some places that become very, very segregated white schools at the same time that you have very, very segregated Black schools in the Central City. So that is to say, a lot of the promises on which both the plaintiffs and the city leaders went to achieve unitary status have not come to pass.
I think we thought that we had progressed to the point where equality among the races meant something, that it was a value that we as a country, as a state, as a city, held.
We integrated schools, and now I feel that schools are segregated again. And I think that's probably the saddest piece to me, that really we came a long ways, but it's almost like because of housing, we have returned to a segregated school system.
When I'm talking about Nashville schools in the 1970s, the 1980s, I'm talking about white students and Black students. Those were the two student populations that were the bulk of the system at that point. Of course, the city has changed tremendously in the last 30 years with a very large and very diverse immigrant population arriving.
Getting ELL teachers, being able to communicate with the parents, it was a challenge.
I was 6 years old when I left Kurdistan. I became a refugee, and then my elementary years were in a refugee camp in Turkey. I came to Nashville as a freshman. My senior year, I decided to wear the hijab. That was the first year that I visibly became known as a Muslim. And I remember bullying and harassment taking place. I would go straight to my teachers. My teachers are like, there's not much I can do about it. Go talk to the counselor. I talked to the counselor. I will never forget what she told me. She said, honey, high school kids can be very mean sometimes. Maybe you should reconsider your wardrobe. And so I just started to think, what exactly is the purpose right now? What is the goal and the mission of the school that I attend? Is it assimilation? Or is it based on integration?
We realize that, one size doesn't fit all. You got to do things differently. You got to look for innovative ideas. Immigrants moving into the city is both a challenge, but it's also just a huge opportunity for the city, because as the city becomes more diverse, it becomes more interesting, it becomes a stronger city.
Many of the families that we serve benefited immensely from the programs that came out of the mayor's office and the programs that are led by many of our partners here.
When I arrived to the States, I arrived to Minnesota. So I was one of the only brown child at the whole school. I realized that I was an undocumented student and what that could potentially mean. Glen Cliff was the transformation for me because I saw what support looked like. I saw people cared. I saw people saw something in me that I probably did not see in myself. Through all those experiences, it made me want to be who I am today. It made me want to give back to the community. I was able to go to college and I studied social justice. I knew what it felt to be an outsider, to not have that advocate, to not have that support system. Once I become a citizen, I would love to run for school board.
Americans have been really interested in putting huge agendas on schools, on saying schools will fix social problems. They'll fix segregation, for example. They'll fix health crises at times. They'll create economic mobility. And we should notice that our investment in schools to achieve those goals has almost always been smaller than our investment in these big systems that generate the inequality around us. So when we turn to schools to make these major changes, we should ask ourselves, compared to what? Compared to our investment in highways or suburbanization or big new stadiums or economic development agendas, are we giving schools the resources that they need to accomplish what we say we think they can accomplish?
I think we will always have problems, and I think it takes collective effort. It takes community impact to address it. I don't think that the superintendent should be on her own in taking care of all the education problems. I think it takes collective work. It takes community foundations. It takes the business sector. It takes the faith sector. It takes residents. It takes neighbors. It takes not just those who have children that go to school. It's every single citizen who comes and collectively says, you know what, we really do care and we value education.
I mean, I'm very old-fashioned, I guess, in a way, and I just think, the secret of a successful society is just each generation is working to make things better for the next one.
When we think about resource inequality right now, we really have to not just notice what's happening in a landscape of uneven wealth and power right at this moment. We have to think about how deep and how long that history is. And so there are grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the Nashville public school system today whose parents had to do the work to try to get access to education because the systems of the state tried to keep it from them.
And as a child, I didn't know how much of a sacrifice it was for me. But I could see the sacrifice of my parents.
We are here to recognize and acknowledge that change requires bravery. To dare to challenge a system that said that children should be separated and educated unequally requires someone to be able to say, I'm going to sacrifice myself in order that those who are coming behind me will have a better life. Your bravery has produced fruit that is still yet growing.
I hope that some of the questions about what constitutes just and equitable education that come out of the desegregation era can be carried into this new space, recognizing though that the city's diversity is much more extensive and varied than it was previously.
Because those courageous conversations are happening, it's giving me some hope around revisiting the purpose of our public schools, and then revising it to make sure that it's better for those that come after me.
I can picture it right now, and there's this look on my dad of just astonishment. It's like he's seeing a superhero, and there's this look on Martin Luther King's face. It's kind of one of those things like, that's why Martin Luther King did what he did, It wasn't so because he would see all this change, but it was that he would affect this little boy that would go on to do these great things. Everything that you do is a manifestation of the work that people that came before you. And, it's absolutely your responsibility and privilege to work every day for people that come after you.
I do understand that the system is and has resegregated. Now that we don't have a lawsuit, who is going to advocate? Who is going to put that pressure? Not in a courtroom, but the table of brotherhood, that Martin Luther King talked about. That's how it's going to be done. And it's just taking people who are willing to carry the baton into the next generation. And I know Nashville can do what it needs to do. There's no doubt in my mind that it can, if it puts its collective mind to it, that we are truly not going to let children fail.
Wow. So I would say, one, thank you to all the people who have just tuned in. I want to take just a moment to go through just all the comments. I see we got Miss Sims, Miss Sweat, Renee Hooten, Wise Kids, Wealth Builders. We got Mr. Scotty Too Hottie. We got Rhea, Adrian Patterson, Mr. Trimble, Nicole Williams Chrisman, Tracy Boyd. Just happened in Nashville, 7 shot, 3 killed, a young kid, shot 9 times. Check on your people. As we look at this, thank you, Miss Nevaeh, Rhea back again. Nicey Sullivan, thank you for checking in. Miss Sasha Holt, thank you. What's the name of this documentary? I'll post it for you guys. But this has been and I see Sonya checking in even on her week off. But this is important. In our fellowship class, we go through a lot of this in about 10 minutes. But to listen to this documentary, this is my 3rd time seeing it, and it still gives me the chills. It still gives me anger of what we went through. I still continue the anger because of what we're going through. But I have hope. Because it took some pretty dedicated individuals to change some things. They just needed backup in the community once they changed the laws. And so, as you guys know, we'll be doing Access Denied this Wednesday. We'll be breaking down this video. So if you had a chance to tune in, please tune in on Access Denied. Give us your thoughts. We're going to bring on some special guests, some of our parents that we haven't talked to in a while on the show. So looking forward to that. But again, thank you guys for tuning in. Please leave us your comments. Mary Sweat says she really enjoys seeing this documentary. Let us know how you feel. And again, big shout out to the Nashville Public Education Foundation, especially my friend Jennifer, who I had the pleasure to work with many, many years ago. Hopefully you guys are taking this documentary on the road. Hopefully this becomes a national thing, because it happened in Nashville, but what we also have to realize, whatever happened in Nashville happened in St. Louis. It happened in Memphis. It happened in Atlanta. It happened in Baltimore. It happened all over the country. But I'm glad that the good people here had a chance to document it and really get people, parents who were kids back then, who live through it to be able to speak about it now. Thank you guys. Have a wonderful Monday night. Welcome back from Thanksgiving break. And we will see you guys on Wednesday at 11 a.m. for Access Denied. Thank you. Feel like a talk show host.